So, with the announcement of these pardons of the January 6th, or individuals that were charged in connection with going to the Capitol on January 6th, what does this do for their criminal convictions or the status of their case had they not accepted a plea or anything like that?
It wipes out their case, whether they've pled guilty, whether they've gone to trial and been convicted by a jury, whether they're still being prosecuted, whether they're in the pre-indictment phase and no formal charges have been brought. The case is wiped out. If they've already been convicted, the conviction is vacated. It doesn't have any legal effect any longer on them. If they haven't been convicted, the government can't go forward with their prosecution of those people for that offense.
So, for the individuals that did take pleas, um, does this impact any of their rights, whether it be to vote or possess a firearm or anything like this, if the conviction has been pardoned or if the offense has been pardoned?
They are granted a clemency, which means that there's not going to be any collateral consequence of the conviction. They can own a firearm. They're not a convicted felon. They have the right to vote if their state has limitations on felons voting, etc. There are no consequences. There sometimes is a debate about whether the record can be treated as though it just never existed. So, for example, um, let's say that you were convicted of a crime involving dishonesty, like writing hot checks or something, and the president pardoned you for that offense, and now you're testifying under oath in an unrelated matter, and so you're asking people to believe you. Can the opposing lawyer confront you with the fact that you were found guilty of writing hot checks and therefore behaving dishonestly, even though you've been pardoned by it? There's some debate about whether or not it allows you to essentially just delete the record completely, or whether it can be used for some purposes against you, for example, as evidence in a proceeding. But in terms of its legal effect, it has no effect any longer on the person. It's no longer an impediment to their ability to work in any field. It's no longer any kind of a restraint on their liberty or their ability to function in society.
Okay, I'm gonna give this just a second because your signal went back down to red.
Shoot, sorry.
No, you're fine. Uh,
And
Yellow.
now it says my connection is unstable.
It's stable now on my end.
Okay, well, I can hear you fine.
Okay, so legally speaking, it's erased technically, but this got so much media attention from, TV stations to print journalism to the Department of Justice itself, even having a repository, if you will, of all of the cases that it has. Does the Department of Justice have to get rid of this, or is this a matter of expunction down the road? Is there a vehicle to have these records purged?
Well, like I said, there's some debate about whether it can be sort of denied, pretend it never happened, sort of a treatment of it. Probably not. There's not a general right to expunction for a federal crime anyway. Um, and the federal government doesn't necessarily have any obligation to comply with state court orders of expunction. So, particularly for these federal defendants, my guess is no, the Department of Justice doesn't have to get rid of their files on these people. They can continue to keep the records. The fact that these people were arrested and charged is a historical event that I don't think the government's going to likely be able to just erase. But there can't be any consequence to these people for what they did. They've been pardoned for it, so they cannot be prosecuted any further. And if they were prosecuted and convicted, it's erased. I mean, it's undone, vacated.
I want to talk about these preemptive pardons. You represent individuals that are accused of crimes. Talk to me about the stigma associated with even being accused of a crime to begin with. The copious amounts of money and time that are spent on defending against these charges. And hey, even if you're found not guilty, or if you're not found guilty of the offense that you're charged with initially, what does this carry long term for these individuals?
It can ruin everything. I mean, it is something that upsets and disrupts every aspect of a person's life just simply being accused of that. That's why grand jury proceedings are secret, is because the hope would be that if we're not sure if someone's committed a crime and we're investigating it, that there be some level of discretion about looking into it, because we don't want to tarnish the reputation of innocent people just simply because there was suspicion that they might have done something wrong. But yeah, once it becomes a matter of public record, well, even if you beat the charges, even if you're successful, it can have devastating consequences for pretty much every facet of your life. I've had clients who have lost their job, clients who have watched their familial relationships just disintegrate, clients who have, attempted to take their own life, clients who have fallen back into the throes of substance abuse, people who are just simply shunned from their communities, whether it's their church, their employment, their social circles. It's a devastating thing, and it's not for the faint of heart to try and defend yourself through all of that. Not to mention the fact it can be financially ruining, not only because you might be at risk of losing your employment or being unable to work, but also because defending someone in court is an expensive proposition, and both the legal fees attached to that and the investigative fees, the cost of procuring experts who might be able to provide scientific knowledge on a given question, or investigators who can go and try to double check the police officers' homework and make sure that the right people were interviewed and the right evidence was collected. All that isn't cheap. So, I mean, that can be a devastating aspect as well. And as we can see in the example we're giving, it can take years for these things to resolve themselves one way or the other. So it isn't like rip the Band-Aid off once sort of experience. It can sometimes be years before you have any closure one way or the other.
And with regard to these preemptive pardons and the presumption of innocence, it's like, do you really need this if you haven't committed a crime? What do you think that this says about that understanding of the presumption of innocence in the United States? Is it actually real? If I can ask that plainly.
Well, I hope it's still real, because it is a legal standard that we ask people to apply in court. Um, I wish that it was more widely understood. The culture is obviously driving away from any sort of respect for the concept of presuming someone innocent unless they're found guilty. And I don't know if that's just because people don't want to go through the mental exercise of deciding whether the evidence is enough to convict someone. I think that's part of it. And part of it is that a lot of these prosecutions are political in their design. So it's really the defendant is almost just the sacrificial lamb, the symbolic representation of whatever the pet issue is of the people that are bringing that said prosecution. And then the court of public opinion decides whether we support that political act of prosecuting this person or we don't support it. And, I make that statement in, I hope, a bipartisan way, because I'm not trying to, attribute blame solely to the Republicans or the Democrats, to the Trump supporters or the people that have been trying to prosecute Mr. Trump. I say it because no matter who is in power, and no matter what scale we're talking about, local district attorney, Department of Justice in DC, whatever, that tendency is a real thing. And so because that seems to be the way that the public relates with prosecuting authority, there's really just no room for the question of whether this person is actually guilty of perpetrating the crime or not. We're here so that the public can get that catharsis of saying, this person is the symbol of what we think is bad. And that's the end of it. We don't want to quibble and argue over whether there's enough proof to get him there.
And then last question from me. I've read that in order to accept a pardon, you have to essentially say that, yes, I am guilty of a crime. Does this also count if you're accepting a pardon, a blanket pardon for any nonviolent offense? Like, yes, I might be guilty of some nonviolent offense.
There are several things to unpack here. The first is to think about what the pardon power is. It is a very broad executive power given to the president in the United States Constitution. Its only real limitation seems to be it can't be used in cases of impeachment. That said, when we talk about it, we need to understand that these are not pardons for future conduct. It would be one thing, I think, to talk about pardoning someone for crimes they have not yet committed. That's not the issue, right? And I don't think we could pardon for that. I mean, maybe I'm mistaken, but I'm fairly certain that's just not a concept. So we're talking about a general pardon for whatever potential conduct occurred during a specific time frame in the past. And that's, I think, acceptable under the broad power that the Constitution gives the president. It's one of his most unchecked and unbridled powers, period. The problem I would see that you have with giving someone a very general pardon of that nature is that because there's no specificity, there could be debate at a later time about whether that language sufficiently pardons someone for conduct. And I mean, there are all sorts of permutations of this. Sometimes crimes are ongoing. People conspire with each other to commit a crime, and it takes years to commit the crime, or they just keep committing it. If it's a mail fraud scheme, a Ponzi scheme, those sorts of things take time to get the money out of the people you're defrauding. And so it could be that you run into situations where someone receives a pardon of a blanket nature for a period of time, but the conspiracy may have run from a period of time previous to that range and runs into the range covered by the pardon. Does the pardon cover it? If the language is too general, there could be debate about that, and that would be problematic for the person receiving the pardon because they don't really know if they're completely protected or not. But to the extent that, I mean, I think the language we talked about for Joe Biden's family was for all nonviolent offenses committed between some year and another year. Okay, so that's great. Violent is an unusual term in the law, and the courts have a horrible time deciding what is a crime of violence and what isn't. And that definition and that list change every year for random reasons. So when you say nonviolent, okay, hopefully that's not too ambiguous, but that's the general gist of it. The other thing you mentioned is sort of what's going on procedurally with this ritual. When the president issues a pardon to someone, the person has to accept the pardon. And there is law going back at least 100 years discussing the fact that typically accepting a pardon is a confession to the offending conduct that the pardon is designed to reach. So if you're accepting a pardon because you think that you might be prosecuted for a crime, there is at least some acknowledgement by that you are deserving of a pardon because you actually committed an offense against the laws of the United States that would need a pardon. I think, again, it's within the president's power to do this. And as far as those individuals are concerned, I think that while the more general nature of the pardon makes it hard for them to know what they're confessing to or what they're admitting they might have accomplished, I think that it's not going to be a prohibition on their ability to receive the pardon. And they need to be just politically shrewd about it. I mean, we are in the era of prosecutorial reprisal for political action. And the only question is whose ox is getting gored at that particular moment. So they probably are smart to accept the pardon because I suspect reprisal is coming. Um, in fact, I mean, the president has not really been particularly shy about threatening that.
Any other thoughts about whether it be the January 6th pardons or just these blanket pardons? It seems kind of unprecedented that we're even discussing this when, 4 years ago, it seemed like, no way, Jose, that's not going to happen. I'm not going to do that. You're not going to see that from my administration. And then fast forward, actually, yes,
Well,
we're seeing that.
it, it's just it's profound because it doesn't happen often in our lifetimes, but it's not that unusual, probably in the grander scheme of things. Um, for one, the power of pardon is an ancient power of the executive. It goes back to the kings of England, which had in various flavors all sorts of tumult and craziness and political intrigue and assassination and all the rest. And so that that aspect of sovereign power has just carried over. It's one of the few things about the sort of unchecked power of the executive we kept from merry old England. Um, and you got to remember that during the Civil War, there had to be extensive use of the pardon authority, the power to grant clemency, along with even some constitutional amendments in the process to try and put the country back together and to allow people who had previously taken up arms against the United States to still participate on some level in civic life. And so, I mean, in that sense, it's not that unusual. Now, what feels weird to me is I don't know if this is a period of history that would compare with, a revolution in England or the Civil War in the United States. I don't know if it's that significant or not. I think that if it is as significant, the consequences are still further down the road. Um, but I mean, we need to be we need to be mindful of the fact that this could in fact be that significant of a period of history. And if it is, we need to ask ourselves, why will it be significant? What about this period of time is markedly different than the other periods of American history that have come before it?
That's it from me. If there's anything else that you think of or anything else that I think of, I will shoot you a text. But yeah, this is going to air at 5, and I think a bite will air at 6.
Okay, cool,
And I will send
cool.
that to you whenever it is live, if I remember.
I
Let me stop
appreciate it.
recording.